all about we're waiting, son, waiting on Roosevelt. Just waiting on Roosevelt. My sister got sick and the doctor wouldn't come because we could not pay him the proper sum. Awaiting, waiting on Roosevelt. We're waiting on Roosevelt. Then one day they put us out of the house. Ma and Pa was meek as a mouse, still waiting, waiting on Roosevelt. Still waiting on Roosevelt. When they felt those cold winds blow, didn't have no place to go. Pa said, I'm tired of waiting on Roosevelt. I can't get a job, I can't get no grub. Backbone and navel's doing the belly rub. I'm tired of waiting on Roosevelt. Tired of waiting on Roosevelt.
Well, welcome everybody to the 6th community conversation, which after the last 2 sessions, which were wholly online, Veterans SA is really delighted to bring to you this community conversation, both face-to-face as well as live streaming through both YouTube and Facebook Live today. So we're trying to maximise accessibility for everybody, which is why we offer these 2 mediums. And also, as you know, this live stream is also recorded and will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel within 48 hours. So just to recap on the purpose of community conversations, this is a 2021 initiative that has been led by Veterans SA, which is in response to feedback from the South Australian veteran community around identifying a thirst for more information and how can we bring that on a variety of topics to the community and bring subject matter expertise, which we can then learn more from and also have the opportunity to ask questions of. So if you have any suggestions of content or future topics, then we would welcome receiving your feedback by email, which is veteranssa@sa.gov.au. So today's topic is how grant funding helps build our community, and it's in a response to a number of previous grant applicants who have been wanting to improve the quality of their applications and also be more aware of some of the considerations that are front and centre of assessment panels and those who then make recommendations of which grants are then successful and those which are not. So from a Veterans SA perspective, we continue to strive to share diverse information to enable informed choice for veterans and their families and their supporters. And today we are delighted to bring together representatives from across all three levels of government to share their insights around grants and also to let you know what other possible sources of funding might be available out there for individuals and or organisations that after this you are free to explore. So joining me today to my immediate left from the Commonwealth Department of Social Services Community Grants Hub is Mr. Brett Coughlin, and you are the Acting Director of Disability Carers and Small Client Agencies.
That's correct.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Next, from South Australian Government, we have Ms. Belinda Powles, who is the Senior Project Officer from Community Investment and Support from Grants SA. So welcome, Belinda.
Thank you.
And then to my cross opposite is from local government is Mr. Dale Sutton, who is the Team Leader of Engagement, Grants and Events from the Onkaparinga Council.
Thanks for having me.
So on your behalf, I warmly welcome our panellists. Now, before we commence proceedings, I do want to acknowledge that even though we are coming to you from the centre of Adelaide into your lounge rooms, that we meet on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and on your behalf and mine, I want to pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and we acknowledge their relationship with the land, sea and sky, and respect their deep connection to our environment and country. I also acknowledge that we are in a slightly different venue today here down at the Torrens Training Depot. Today we are on level 1 in the Combined Ex-Services Mess, and I'd like to thank the Mess President and the Air Force Association for hosting today's community conversation. So, I think we should just leap straight into it. So the first question for Brett, Belinda and Dale, and I'll start with you, Brett, we'll be quite orderly and just move down the line for this one, is given that we have all three jurisdictions and represented today and the variety of organisations that you each come from, could you each spend a minute, starting with you, Brett, introducing yourselves, talking about the role and the experience that you bring to bear for our audience for this community conversation on grants funding today.
Sure, thank you. I'll kick off. Hi everyone, my name's Brett Coughlin. I'm with the Community Grants Hub, which is actually part of the Department of Social Services, Commonwealth Department. I'm based here in Adelaide in Weymouth Street with around about 100 other people. And basically what we do is manage grants on behalf of client agencies. So we're a little bit unique here in South Australia in that we do manage a lot of client agencies here. Some of the other states mainly manage the DSS and health grants. What we manage here in South Australia is grants for the Department of Home Affairs, Prime Minister and Cabinet, Attorney General's Department, Veterans Affairs, Department of Education, Skills and Employment, Department of Agriculture, Health and of course Social Services. Prior to moving to Adelaide in 2012, I worked in the national office of DSS and its predecessor, and I was involved in the whole grants life cycle. So it was designing grant programs, the assessment phase, setting up assessment centres, managing grants, and then the evaluation of grants as well. I'd probably say why establish a grants hub, and that was a decision of government going back to 2015. It was decided that there was a lot of duplication amongst client agencies. There was confusion for grant recipients, people applying for grants. Government said, look, we can make some efficiencies here, but we can improve the processing, improve probity, improve dollar value of grants and improve processes. So in 2016, July 2016, the Community Grants Hub was stood up. And currently now we manage grants for around about 6,500 organisations, and that's around about 21,000 grants that we currently manage.
Wow.
It's a bit, yeah.
There is quite a lot that your Grants Hub looks after, and that's mostly from what you've described of the agencies that are represented with your hub. It's mostly in the social policy space. So when you talk about like Prime Minister and Cabinet, I'm guessing that includes Indigenous Affairs and some of their smaller portfolio agencies as well?
We do manage that. Indigenous Affairs has now moved off into National Indigenous Australia's agency, and we do manage some of those grants, not a lot at the moment. There are still some agencies shifting over into the shared services model. Prime Minister and Cabinet, it's mainly the Office for Women, which is a subsection of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and we manage those grants, women's leadership grants, projects, those sort of things.
Great. Well, welcome, Brett. And I think we're really grateful to have somebody who's had over 10 years of deep experience in setting up grant programs as well as running them. And certainly with the really wide mix of agencies that your hub supports. I'm hoping that by virtue of the conversation we have today, that people will not be interested only in the DVA Commonwealth grants that you administer, but also recognising that there are a large suite of other grants that one might be eligible for as well that we might not have thought of before, like you just said, Office for Women or through an Indigenous lens. So welcome. Belinda.
Hello everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Belinda Poles, and I've been working with the Department of Human Services Grants SA for approximately a year, but previously I've worked in grants and funding for the South Australian arts community. I've worked for the South Australian Film Corporation and also a youth arts organisation. So I've had lots of experience from different organisations. I also just wanted to let you know that in a previous life I was an artist, so I have applied for grants. I've also peer assessed grants as a professional, and now I'm running a program. So I suppose I just wanted to say I do understand the process is sometimes challenging. I also understand that it's sometimes difficult when you feel that you weren't successful. I suppose I'm trying to say that grants funders are human, and we do get what we ask of you, but we also have to have a certain amount of information to be able to make the peers understand what we're looking for in a grant. So I just wanted to humanise it a bit. And I suppose leading on from that, some of the role that I do in human services is our focus is very clearly on communities facing vulnerability or disadvantage. And so we sometimes have themes to our work. For the last year we had a COVID grant to support communities through the difficulties of COVID. Previously we had larger themes, and I wish I could talk a little bit more about what we're doing next, but it hasn't been released yet. But generally some of my role includes writing guidelines, application and assessment forms, putting together peer assessment panels and supporting peers through that assessment process, contracting if you're successful, and I think most importantly, being on the end of the phone to be able to talk to potential applicants about their proposal and whether it may or may not fit within the guidelines and eligibility processes. And then also providing feedback at the end of a round for both successful and unsuccessful applicants. But I know we're going to talk about some of those things a bit later.
Yes, and I'll make sure that I'll ask you those questions, Belinda, not only as a representative of state government, but also thank you for sharing with us that you can definitely relate to a number of the people who are watching this today around some of the challenges of why am I being asked this question. So I'm hoping to unpack that a little bit more during the conversation. So thank you. And Dale, tell us about your role in local government down at Onkaparinga Council.
I've been at council for about 13 years and in the grant space for probably 10 of those years. My role looks after a team of people, similar to Brett, where we've seen different teams administering grants. We've brought them all together to centralise it because there's more consistent customer service, consistent processes, and just a better way of managing the grants process. So we have about 15 grants at Onkaparinga. Other councils would have more or less than that. But our role is to sort of coordinate the grants program, promote it to the community to make sure they hear about it, and to make sure that all the grants are administered in a fair and equitable way, and to channel through that whole process to make sure it happens smoothly and people get back to the applicants as quickly as possible with the outcome of their grants.
Yeah, great. And you talk about ensuring that the grants are administered in a fair and equitable way, and you've each said that in a variety of language, and I think that's really an important foundation piece for government grants programs, regardless of the level, because that instills confidence then in applicants in ensuring then there is a consistency and there's a fair and equitable assessment process for people applying for often very limited funding. I'm sure we can all attest that there's never quite enough money for the number of applicants who apply. So thank you. Well, welcome, Dale. So we know that grants come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and have a different focus, and you touched on that, Belinda, when you talked about some of the guidelines that you've written for different grants programs. So maybe I'll start back with you then, Dale, and we'll work our way back along. Can you reflect about some of the sorts of grants that are available in local government, either in Onkaparinga or just giving us a sense of that jurisdiction and the sorts of broadly, the sorts of programs or initiatives or focal areas that local councils often focus on to give grants?
Yeah, local government, I guess, being very close to the community, we try to cater for everything that people are looking for. And I know you'll touch on strategically why grants are offered, but we try to, I guess, reward the incentive of the community to make sure that we're providing funding for their ideas. As long as it aligns with what we're trying to deliver. We have a whole range of grants from upgrading heritage buildings, running events, programs, purchasing small equipment, you name it. There's a whole range of different grants, and most councils would offer quite a broad range as well. I guess the bigger the council, the more broad the range probably is likely to be.
That makes sense. And does each council run to put you on the spot, are you aware that most or all councils do run at least one grants round a year in South Australia?
I'd say the vast majority. I think there's 68 councils in South Australia. I think the vast majority would have some sort of grants program running. Yep.
Yes, I certainly see massive signs in my suburb of what's available, and it closes in 20 days. So thanks, Dale. Brett.
Over to me?
Yes.
Look, mainly the majority of the grants that we manage are in the areas of social services. So it's a whole stack of stuff. It's housing and homelessness support, families programs, children's services, financial resilience, emergency relief. That came out quite a bit in COVID last year, had a high focus. Women's programs, as I've mentioned, men's programs, community safety, support for veterans, community cohesion and volunteer grants. So it's a wide gamut of grants that we're providing. I can talk a little bit about the different types of grants, if you want me to throw that in here. So we used to call them block funded grants, but they're kind of our main grants, are broad-based grants. So they're standard services across a wide range of locations. They address a common need through a fairly uniform service delivery model. And they're usually the larger dollar amount funded programs. We then have programs which is based around capacity building, and enabling projects. So it might be looking at a sector and building capacity of the sector. We have one-off support, so smaller community-based projects, which are probably a little bit similar to what Dale does. We then have some individualised support. So this is more around eligible clients. It's based on need, not about location. So it's generally around a fixed pool of funding and a wide range of services. The notion of consumer choice is involved in these ones, and I think you look at NDIS, the changes brought in by NDIS is a good example, and also aged care, where there's a bit more consumer choice for those programs. And then not forgetting capital support. There is some capital support grants that we manage on behalf of client agencies as well. So they're the main sorts of grants that we manage. And the reason why we fund grants is mainly to support the community, meet outcomes that are not met by individualised support. So we have a social security system, we have an age pension, that sort of thing. But we have grants funds available so that we can provide other services, especially around the community, that develop the community, and support other broader needs in our community. That's the main reason why we fund grants on behalf of our client agencies. They're similar to contracts. There is a little bit of debate about what is a grant and what is a contract, and that's been going on for a lot of years, and often it's down in the detail. So I try not to really distinguish them. If you're writing for a contract, you're writing for a grant. There's no real difference. You need to address the selection criteria.
All right, great. Now I'm just going to ask for clarification on two phrases that you used. Capital support, do you mean that's bricks and mortar?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. And you also used a phrase capacity building. Can you help us understand skating on the edge, on the top, I should say, not on the edge. What does that mean?
It's about building the capacity of an organisation to be able to provide service delivery and good service delivery. Mm-hmm. So especially in regional and remote areas, we might have organisations that struggle to deliver programs, and policy will generally identify that. They'll look at program evaluation, they'll establish that there might be a thin market, for example, in this area. So what can we do to bring providers along or build the capacity of providers? So it could be around things like governance training for organisations so that they're better able to manage themselves. But it could be other things in building the capacity of that organisation.
So maybe training of paid staff to be able to do something they couldn't do before. Yeah, great. All right, wonderful. And then just to call it out then, as I said at the beginning, it's about, this is sort of general in nature around grants funding in particular, without particular focus on any one grant program. But I know I'm going to anticipate a question from the floor. From a Commonwealth perspective, then you look after all of the DVA grants that the community would be familiar with, so saluting their service, veterans and community grants programs, that all sits within your bailiwick?
That's right. Yeah, we do it in partnership and on behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs. So the policy area sits in Department of Veterans Affairs. Mm-hmm. We will get the grants, there'll be an assessment process and we'll manage those grants. And the thing about the Veterans Affairs grants is that they have a fairly high turnover. They're generally, 1-year grants, which is good in terms of it gives opportunities for more players to apply next year in the grants.
Yeah.
But yeah, we do manage those, saluting their service and supporting younger veterans and other programs.
Great. All right. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail a bit later. But Belinda, then, from a state government perspective, what Grants SA looks after, can you help us understand what's the same and what's different to what the two gentlemen have said?
Yes, so Grants SA is a one-off program for 1-year funding. We manage about $3 million a year in grants for not-for-profit community organisations, basically to improve community participation, wellbeing and quality of life for people in South Australia, with the key focus, as I've been saying, is to address vulnerability and disadvantage. I must also emphasise that we're not just Adelaide focused. We very actively encourage applications from regional and remote South Australia. And I think the way I can best discuss the last two grants, I hate the word, but as everyone knows, we all had to pivot as a result of COVID. So we used to run an annual program twice a year of minor and major grants, $10,000 and $100,000. But obviously COVID changed community needs greatly. So we, with approval from our minister, ceased that funding for the major and minor and converted our funding to COVID support. And they were $10,000 grants for community organisations to be able to equip their staff to, say, work from home. So it was IT grants, personal protective gear, and for the first time we offered food relief for small community organisations as well, which was quite a shift for us. So that program ran from April until October, and then we assessed that, and then we thought COVID was moving on, and we felt that the greatest need community organisations had after that sense of isolation and disconnect. We felt that the sense of community wellbeing and belonging was really key. So we ran a really small program because, that horrible thing of funding left, called Reconnect. So it was to try and support communities to reconnect with each other. And it could have been to purchase equipment or hire a project officer to deliver a special program, and that funding had a cap of $25,000. And as I was saying, we're still working on our next program because the way COVID has impacted the community, we have to adapt what we're doing, and so we're just waiting for sign-off from that. But hopefully we should have something up on our website by September, and I'm really sorry I can't say any more about that.
All right. Well, that's all right. We'll keep in touch, and then when you have released that, then we'll send that out through our social media channels as well.
Yeah, absolutely happy to do that.
All right. And tomorrow is September, but I'm guessing it's not tomorrow.
No.
All right.
It'll be later on in the
And I think that's a really important point that you make as well, Belinda, is that grants programs are not static.
Yeah.
There's obviously, and we'll talk in a moment about the process, but I guess from a governance perspective, it's really important that all grants programs have an evaluation piece at the end to work out what worked well, what didn't, and what are the evolving needs of the community that you're supporting.
And also, can I jump in there on
Yes,
that one?
yes.
When you write an acquittal, don't be frightened to say what didn't work, because sometimes we learn as much from what didn't work or was unsuccessful as what did. So don't gloss it over in that way, because we use those documents to make an assessment of where we should be going and what community need may be into the future. It's a little bit different with COVID because it was the great unknown. We actively encourage you to say what didn't work or what you would have done differently, because that's how we all grow and learn. And we learn from you as much as hopefully you're learning from us today. So it's a fluid process. It's not yes, no, black, white. It's a very evolving process.
That's very true, Belinda. Now I think that's a beautiful segue then that we've each sort of touched on. So maybe Dale, again, you can maybe kick us off. From your lens of local government, can you give us a broad overview of how a typical grants process works start to finish? Because I think there'll be some commonality, but then we can discover what the differences are as well.
Yeah, I think you'll find it's very similar across all levels of government. Obviously, grants open at some point. Most grants have an open and close date. Some grants are open all year round and they are there until the funds are fully expended. And sometimes that's first in, best dressed, but there's not a lot of those kind of grants. Most of them do have an open and close date, and the reason we do that is because we can then get all the applications in and make sure the best ones get funded. So there's usually a period of 6 weeks, 8 weeks, a period of time anyway that the grants are open. And once they've closed, then they get assessed by the grants officer, usually to make sure they're eligible, make sure that the organisation that's applying is an eligible organisation for that grant. We get a lot of businesses wanting to apply for grants that are only open for the community, for example, or individuals who are not actually a registered organisation that might not be eligible for a grant. So we check that first, make sure they're eligible, then it goes through to an assessment panel. And that panel might be staff, it might have councillors or elected members on that panel, it might have community members on that panel depending on what it is. And that panel would then assess each application and score them, and based on those scores then rank each of those applications. And it's quite hard, they've got quite a hard job to do because they're comparing often apples and oranges, very different. For example, in events you might be comparing a Christmas carols event to an RSL dawn service. Very different events. But both things the community love, and then how do you work out which is the best one? So they're making recommendations for funding based on what's in the application, the quality of the application, and then those recommendations from the panel go through normally to council as the decision maker to sign off on that actual grant allocation, and then we can get back to the grant applicants, usually by email, but otherwise by letter, to let the applicants know whether they were successful or not. Offer them feedback if they want it on their application, especially if they were unsuccessful. We encourage them to contact us and talk through their application so they can improve it for next time. And we do encourage people to apply again. And then we send out a contract. We call it conditions of funding, but other organisations will use different terms, but it's basically a funding contract that we get signed and sent back. Sometimes that's done electronically these days. And then once that comes back, we can allocate the funding. Then the community groups or the business or whoever's get the funding go off and do the great work that they do. And then once that's finished, they send through an evaluation or an acquittal process, as we usually term it, to tell us how it all went. And we then use that, as Belinda said, to learn from that process and evaluate our whole grants process. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And that can be anything from a 8 to 12 week process through to a 6-month process, depending on the scale of the grant and the number of applications.
That's very comprehensive, and there's lots of steps, and what I'm hearing in that is like right from the beginning when the grants officer checks eligibility, that's a very much a clear in-out process, and then when the selection panel is there and debating the merits of equally valuable projects that can demonstrate real value to the community, that's where that fair and equitable process is so important to be able to give confidence back into the community as well.
Exactly.
So great. Well, thank you, Dale. So Belinda, what part of that is different in state government?
It's pretty much spot on, except for us, we do have the peer panel, but it's the minister that signs off on our funding. So that's, the end point is slightly different, but our peer assessment panel goes through the full assessment. It's reviewed by our director and then forwarded to our minister through a briefing. So that process can take a bit of time, depending what's happening. And there's just one other little thing that with our guidelines, we do have some really peculiar things that we don't fund. We've got quite a list. One of them is scholarships and sponsorships, but we don't fund first aid equipment or emergency equipment. And so in that process of understanding your grant, really be clear on those guidelines. They're quite spelt out what funds do and don't do. And unfortunately, we have quite a list of criteria you have to meet to be eligible. So we only fund organisations that have been operating in South Australia for over 12 months, have not-for-profit objectives, are incorporated. So there's quite a list. It is all outlined in guidelines, but I can't emphasise enough, read those lists and make sure that you're eligible, because it's, on my end, it's really hard to make someone ineligible because they've applied for a defibrillator, and we understand community need and all those things, but it's actually something that we don't fund. And it's not that you're a terrible community or we don't respect your need or anything. It was just an exclusion for other reasons. And with Grants SA, I find our name a little bit unfortunate because we are community grants, and we're not the catch-all for every South Australian government grant, which I'd like to add community into our program, but the program was named before I was working there. So there are grants through sport and recreation, arts, tourism, all sorts of other organisations. So we're quite clear also that we don't fund say a sporting club for sporting outcomes. If they were doing something that was more for a community development, say in reconciliation or something, it may be considered. But so just understand those nuances of the guideline is just something that I'd like to add. Yeah. I think that's...
And we'll come back to guidelines in a moment as well, because I guess that what I'm hearing is that is the pivotal document for people to be able to identify how their proposal does or doesn't fit, and it's not always, it's kind of like a job application, you can't always quite make it fit for what it is.
And it's hard to get that letter saying, sorry, your application didn't proceed because you were not eligible, because this was something either we don't fund or your organisation's not eligible for this reason. But we have to have some filters. So before you put all the work into writing it, just check that through. And if you're unsure, give someone a call. The most important piece of advice I can give you, I think, if you're unsure, call a project officer.
Yeah, and I guess again that comes back to being fair and equitable. That's why guidelines exist, so you can compare apples with, or fruit with fruit, maybe, given you said apples and oranges. So so then moving to you, Brett, because as you pointed out, the policy areas are resident in the respective departments, but you administer the grants process. Is there? I would imagine there's some different things in the Commonwealth to what Belinda and Dale have described.
Look, a little bit. It is fairly similar, though. In a broad respect, it is fairly similar. So, again, we have a closing date for the grant. Once the grant closing date has finished, then we'll be in a pre-assessment phase. So the hub has pretty much a dedicated assessment centre. The application will then go to an assessor who will go through and look at the application. Sorry, I should say prior to that, there is the pre-assessment checks. So there's eligibility checks, similar to what Dale said. It might be, there might have been 2 applications lodged inadvertently, that sort of thing that we need to check. So as we move into selection, then a trained and dedicated assessment officer will go in and assess the grant. They'll go into the scoring, they'll write an analysis of that grant. That will then go to a moderator, so what we call a moderator, who will look at a number of assessments and make sure that the assessment was correct. It's a bit of a quality assurance step as well. But it also looks, are there any outliers, that sort of thing. We'll then move up to a selection panel manager who will look at the selection more as abroad, the whole grant selection, and then a selection report will be written. At that point, it will go across to the client agency and they will create a decision brief. So that will generally be a decision brief, will go up to a minister to make a decision. Following a decision, that can be a little bit of time can pass before that happens. Following a decision, outcomes will be advertised, organisations will be contacted, there'll be funding agreements will go out, and then we'll go through that funding agreement negotiation and kick off the process there. So that's kind of how it flows. It is very similar, other than I think, as you've kind of flagged, that with the client agency approach, we do the assessment and then hand it over to the client agency, who take it forward to the minister from there.
Yeah, they bookend it. They
Exactly.
have the genesis of the idea and the guidelines,
Correct.
and then the final decision making.
Yeah.
So, so then I'm going to ask a supplementary question, Brett. So Belinda talked about right at the end of her last statement around the importance of contacting the contact officer and their role, which I'll explore a bit more with everybody else. But given that you don't own the content, you own the process on behalf of half a dozen other agencies. If somebody does have a question about one of the grants that you administer, who does that go to, and where are the limits of your ability to assist?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, people can either go to the client agency if they have particular questions. They can also go to, we have a Community Grants Hub hotline, so people can call that hotline. And I can mention it, perhaps at the end might be better to mention it. People can call that hotline and ask any questions that they may have. The Hub may be able to answer that question, or the Hub may refer someone to a client agency if it's a question that the client agency has responsibility over.
So a technical or content one versus a procedural one?
Generally,
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So Belinda, given that you did pose that, so what does that look, I'm guessing all of the Grants SA have, Community Grants SA, all have a contact officer listed?
We have a Grants SA number, and with COVID we had to change our process, so we didn't all have our phones diverted, so there was a central number that then we would either call people back or email them. So we don't have names. I'm not quite sure why, but with arts we did. It's just different processes.
Sure.
But we are here to help you. I think that's a really important thing to say, and that so helping you is helping you understand if you're eligible, helping you understand the criteria, because the criteria form the key of that assessment process, helping you make sure that your budget balances. I'm trying to give you all the reasons sometimes things don't score as well, but I think it's also important to say, just because you've called a project officer and talked about your proposal, it doesn't guarantee your funding, you know, or anything like that, which is unfortunate. But yeah, our role is very much to support you. So we'll try and answer anything we can, but we can't actually sort of read a project description and say edit it for you. It'd be lovely if we could, but we would be very busy. And yeah, so I just needed to sort of make that quite clear. Yeah.
I'm pleased, because I was going to ask about where are the limits to that, between answering some general questions to some very specific, can I read you this passage and can you tell me what you think? So, okay, that makes sense.
Do that. But sometimes we do look at budgets and we can't tell you what to do or not to do, but we could pose the question, are you sure that's eligible? Or, you know, that sort of thing to prompt. But budgets are quite often sometimes the problems with funding, if they're not balancing or they're not making sense. And in your project's description, make sure that your budget relates to your project description. I know that sounds a really simple thing to say, but quite often you'll have a project description and the items asked for in the budget aren't referred to. And so there's a disconnect. And sometimes if the peer assessor can't work that out, then you might not score as highly in a certain criteria as you may have if you'd made that relationship between the two parts of an application. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Can I just jump in?
Please.
In terms of help while a grant round is in process, there's also questions and answers that will be published on the Grant Connect site, which I can again go in and talk a little bit about. But as questions might come up from grant applicants, they'll be collected by the area and they might be published as FAQs. So it's important if you're applying for the grant to there's a grant opportunity guidelines, but there may be clarifying questions as well. And because of probity, we're not going to tell someone an answer and not publish that more broadly. So that's a process that's used to help.
Yeah, again, fair and transparent. I'm hearing that as a core principle throughout. Dale, did you have anything to add to that around contact officers?
Yeah, I want to just agree with what Belinda is saying about pick up the phone and have that conversation. While the grants officer can't guarantee that they'll push your application through, they can tell you straight away if you're going to be eligible. They can tell you if that thing that you want to apply for is something that's likely to be funded, or whether you're better off looking at a different grant or looking elsewhere for that grant. We understand that putting together a grant application takes a lot of time, and they all vary, but most people who are applying for grants are volunteers for a volunteer organisation. We understand that. We don't want to waste your time. So pick up the phone, have that initial conversation before you start, and if you feel like you're getting the green light that what you're wanting to apply for might be eligible, then away you go. And then if you do get stuck during the application process, again, pick up the phone, say, I'm not sure what this question's asking for, then you can probably get some guidance around the types of things we're expecting to see in that response to that particular question. So I'm not sure exactly how much people will give you in terms of that response to that question, but you'll get at least a little bit of a guidance about what the scoring is going to look like. Is it about community outcomes, or is it about how it's going to improve things for your organisation, those kind of things. You'll get a little bit of a hint, but then it's up to you to go away and write that. But don't be scared to pick up that phone.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable advice. Belinda?
In our guidelines, we have actually an assessment matrix. So we say community need, community impact, a couple of key questions. And we're actually really transparent about how much weighting that question has as an overall assessment. So value for money is an important one, that's 20%. Community impact is really important to us, so that's 40%. And in that matrix, there are a series of guiding questions to help you be able to pitch what you need to address in that. So we try and be as transparent as we can with that too. So we actually do publish that matrix in the guidelines so that you've got some prompts to know how to take that answer. Yeah.
No, thank you. And speaking about questions, I just checked my phone. For those who are watching us live stream, you can type a question in if you're watching on YouTube or on Facebook Live. But also, if we have any questions from the floor, we do have a question from the floor. Yes, Dion.
So understanding...
Oh, we have a microphone, Dion.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. All right, so basically I've written a few grants, some successful, some fall over. My basic question is it's a bit of an art form really, and I was wondering if there's any resource out there, like a short course or potential for Veterans SA to run some sort of workshop around writing grants, because in my experience, I'd really like to prepare before even getting online. I'd like to be able to have all that information ready to go before I'm going through and writing those, going through the application process, because at points along the process, I find within the document, you might get halted or you can't move further forward without having the answers to those questions. And then sometimes you might have set aside one day to write that grant. You've already had it all in your head, but you weren't fully prepared to be able to do it in that day. Does that make sense? Is there any resource out there to be able to assist people with a bit of a knowledge base around how to prepare best to write those grants?
I can't speak for other levels of government, and I can't even speak for all the councils, but City of Onkaparinga certainly offer grant writing training When we open up our grant round, that's one of the things we'll advertise straight away and encourage people to come along. Obviously, we limit it to groups within our own area, but other councils might offer something similar. So there are courses out there because grant writing is a skill. It actually is a skill set, like putting together a good job application, similar kind of thing. So if you can get into a course that actually goes through that process, that will certainly help you.
Yeah, great.
We don't have that service at current. We've just been, since COVID, trying to work out how we can transfer that information to people. So we are thinking of hosting community meetings to discuss particular grants, but also we're trying to work through the process of maybe making short videos to put on our website of, this is what a balanced budget is, and maybe try and keep them a couple of minutes so to explain different parts. That's what I'd like to do ultimately. It hasn't happened yet, but it's something we're strongly discussing. Just as a really basic thing, with our form, so we use the Smarty Grant system, you can go into and just download a copy of the form, and you can write notes on that, and you sound like a very prepared person, so you could do the work you have, get through. If you get stuck on something, you've got your basic outline. That's the perfect opportunity to then ring your project officer and say, hey, I've got my project description and this, but I'm stuck on this question. Would you be able to provide me some assistance? And you've got like the overall flow of the form, so you can see where you need specific support. That might be a short-term way. If you could attend a grant writing workshop. There are professional grant writers, but yeah, that's not something that we encourage, because our organisations are community organisations, and we won't fund grant writers in our applications. That's something that we don't do.
Yeah.
And I think from my perspective, it's a good question. It's a similar answer. Unfortunately, we don't offer grant writing training. It's maybe something we can think of down the track, but we haven't at this point offered any grant writing training. I can see where you're coming from in terms of being prepared, and I'd often say to people, if you can write your application offline, get the questions and the criterion first, write it offline. You can do all you want with it offline, and then it becomes a final process of uploading. But yeah, good question.
So I'm going to ask a supplementary question. You talked at the beginning, we clarified what you mean by capacity building. Have you seen in your lengthy experience in Commonwealth Grants that building capacity of organisations or a sector to be able to improve their grant writing to be competitive for other things you administer? Have you seen that before?
Good question. No. Perhaps indirectly. The capacity building is helping things like governance. It's mainly concentrated on service delivery.
Yeah, okay.
But, if that indirectly assists, perhaps it does, but I think it's more of a niche, the grant writing.
That makes sense, as opposed to long-term foundational change in capacity building. Okay, that's fine. Great question. Thank you, Dion. Yeah. And we also had the same question online, so obviously that's a popular one. And Belinda, when you create those little videos, we would love to promote them.
Well, there's an organisation called Foundation for Rural Development, and they do have one. I'll send you through the name.
Please.
Because we've looked at that and thought, wouldn't that be great, something that we could do like a cross-government thing? Because once you get the skill, it applies probably equally to all levels of government.
Yes.
So I'm sorry, I can't think of the name of the organisation, but I'll send
You can share it with us afterwards, and we'll share that with our community as well. So, so I guess where we're in a similar vein then, what I'm hearing, the question I'm going to ask is each of you is, what are the top 3 things that you would recommend to potential applicants to consider before they or during their grant application? But if I can just summarise what I've heard as the top 3 things from the 3 of you, the first one is read the guidelines. See if you're eligible.
Read and understand.
Read and understand the guidelines. The second bit is, if you have questions, contact the contact officer. And then the third bit is, as you're writing or before you submit your application, make sure that the bits of the application join up. So that was your point, Belinda, around in your project description, if you're making sure that that aligns with what the budget ask is and vice versa. So I guess that's what I've heard from you as repeatedly the top 3 things. Brett, is there anything else that you would add to that?
Yeah, I've thought about this, the top 3 things. So my number 1 top tip would be to read the grant opportunity guidelines. Know your program. I can't stress it enough. It's amazing how many don't pick up and they just misfire on answering questions that the guidelines have outlined that the grant is about. Policy areas, when they develop programs, that they put the outcomes in the grant opportunity guidelines, but they'll do a bit of work before that. And often it's a thing called a program logic. And what the program logic does is it identifies what are the inputs to this program, what are the outputs that we want to see, and then what are the longer term outcomes. And a good example of this is something like the Men's Shed program. It's been around for a while. It was created in Australia in the 90s. It's since been exported to the UK. And you can go and Google Men's Shed program guidelines and you can find a couple of academic, evaluations of it. And you'll see a nice diagram for a program logic. So what is it? Basically a men's shed, the input is having a space. It's having funding, obviously. And then what are the outputs from that? Well, it's bringing men together. Men discuss issues. It's a work-like kind of atmosphere that we're in. It might be a regular thing. You come back one day a week or one day every 2 weeks. You're building a project. What are the more longer term outcomes of that? And it's more around, it's men's health, it's reducing social isolation, those sort of things. Now, when you put your kind of policy hat on, that's what they're looking at. That won't necessarily translate out in the program guidelines, but thinking about it in that way, you can kind of think, well, if I'm going to apply for this, what do I need? What do I want to deliver as a short-term output? And then what is the program trying to get in the longer term? So I think you won't always see that in the programs. You'll see the grant opportunity guidelines, which will highlight here are the longer term outcomes. It's doing some thinking in your own head around that program and what is that program wanting in the short term and then the longer term to get the outcomes. So that's what I would say in terms of know the program, the grant opportunity guidelines. The second thing is know your organisation. What can your organisation reasonably deliver? Don't apply for a grant that you just don't have capacity to deliver. It's not going to end well and it can reflect badly on your organisation. At the very least, if you're a new provider in a new grant program, you might have some more monitoring or you might be assessed as higher risk. And I don't say that in order to stop people from applying, just be aware of it. Know your capabilities. What staff do you have? What staff can you put on this program? What are the qualifications of staff? What kind of organisational things do we have, like do we have an assurance framework in our organisation, etc., etc. Now, this won't apply to all grants, but it may be for some of those larger grants. It's a bit proportional. I've seen a lot of grant applications where they just don't outline the qualifications of staff, or it's a grant program for training and they say they'll deliver training, but they don't describe what the training is, how long the training is for, when the training will occur, all of that sort of stuff. And the third thing I would say is know your target cohort. Know the group that you're providing the services for. It's critical. How do we as an organisation engage with that group? Do we engage much at all? You'd be surprised, some organisations don't engage very well at all with the target group. And also know the sector and other organisations. Maybe your organisation is good at partnering with other organisations. Maybe someone will come into your organisation and you can't assist them, but you know another organisation that can assist them. It's good to highlight the sort of things and the value that your organisation adds. That's what I'd probably say.
Yeah, great. No, very comprehensive. Thank you. Belinda, is there anything additional that we haven't covered yet?
Always that question about your contacting your project officer. Another thing that I'd really suggest if you have time, ask someone who knows say generally about your organisation, ask them to review your application, because they can often pick up links or points or things that are not making sense and help that clarity, because a peer assessor is obviously going to review your application, but if something's not making sense, then you may not score as highly as you could have. So it's just a really general thing about grants. And I suppose building on what Brett was saying about the matrix, I have a sort of set of questions which I call the who, what, when, why, how. So I'll just read off a few because they might help you focus in, and they might not all be relevant, but it hopefully helps you align your proposal to what the fund is seeking. So really basically, why are you seeking this funding? Why is this project important? How will you deliver this project? Who is seeking the funding and who will benefit? What will the impact of these funds for the community or organisation involved? What will the impact of this project be? How will this be measured? How will the funds be spent? What do you hope will happen at the end? Just a few really key pointers to try and keep you focused through that, to hold that in the back of your mind. Hopefully those sorts of points are some of the questions that the peers are considering in their assessment. Oh, and one other thing, and let's hope you're all successful with your funding. I think it's also important for you to, with government grants, state government grants, to understand that your budget and your proposal for us help us form your contract. So in your budget, if you've got project officer, travel and accommodation and a training wage, if you end up going and buying 5 computers and a new car, we've contracted you on what you've said you need. The peers have assessed that need and supported it with funding. And then if you completely change the direction of your funding without authorisation or contact, then with us, you may be asked to repay that funding. So I just wanted you to sort of understand that if successful, we build the contract from what you've asked for. So I'm trying to put the ownership back on, so consider that, because we do have situations where understandably a project hasn't gone as expected. So if you contact us before the end date of your contract and say, look, we had an underspend on X, we believe that doing Y will still fulfil the contract, we can go through a contracting change and authorise that. Whereas if you send that in an acquittal later, there may be the possibility you'll be asked to return the funds. So I just sort of wanted to explain that link. It's not that necessarily that we're being tough, it's just the peers have assessed your need and supported that. So just wanted to make that relationship with funding.
Really valid point. No, thank you. And we might revisit the acquittal process a little bit later.
Oh, sorry.
No, but I've made a note because of that. And Dale, do you have anything different in your top 3?
Yeah, I'd build on what the other 2 have said in terms of the guidelines being important, but that also tells you why the grant program exists. Each organisation that has a grant is giving it out because they want to achieve something, and they can probably achieve it better with your help as the applicants. So whether that's building capacity or whatever it might be, look into the why. Why does that grant program exist? Because we will know why your project's important to your group, but why should the funding organisation give you funding to support that? So you're actually asking them for money, and so what's in it for them as the funding group? Because what I hear a lot when people call us up is how passionate they are about their project, and that is fantastic because we know that means they're going to make sure it actually is delivered. But what we're listening for is what's in it for us as a council, giving that funding out. If we're looking for capacity building or reducing social isolation or whatever that grant program is trying to achieve, that'll be written into the guidelines, and you'll see it right up the top about the purpose of the program and what it's trying to achieve. So look for that and make sure what you're delivering is actually going to achieve that, and then weave that in through your whole application about making sure it's going to achieve the why for the funding organisation rather than the why you want to deliver that project. So that's one key thing. You touched on getting someone in to peer review your application, someone else in your organisation. I'd even go a step further and say break up the application, download the form if you can and see what's in it, and get your treasurer to go and do the budget, get someone else to go and write something else. Don't take it all on yourself. It's a lot of work to put it together an application. And you might be fine, you might have a day to smash it all out, and that might be the best way to do it. But in other cases, you might think, oh, well, let's break this up and share it across the committee or whoever you're working with, and get them to do bits and pieces, as long as someone's casting an eye over it at the end to make sure the language is consistent and it works. But you might be able to share the love. And the final bit of feedback is to ask for feedback. So whether you're successful or not, but most importantly, if you're not successful, ask for feedback from the funding body about why didn't this get through. And they're usually more than happy to explain where you fell down, where it didn't quite align with the why for the organisation, how you can improve it for next time. And it shouldn't be a no, you're never going to get the funding, it's a no, not this time. And so most grant rounds will have multiple rounds. There might be another one next month, next year. Apply again and learn from that, the lessons from the failed application. Or even if you're successful, you might get tips on how to improve for next time.
All really valuable information there, and from really different perspectives, so thank you. Now I'm conscious we've got about 10 minutes until the end of our community conversation, so if you have any questions, then for those in the room, just put up your hand and we'll bring the microphone. For those who are online, you're more than welcome to type a question in. I do have a question from the floor, yes.
You sort of touched on this, but in your assessment, how do you validate claims that people make in their application? For example, if there might be a criteria around the economic benefit or the number of jobs created, and they put in a number like 20 or something like that. And sometimes they put a higher number in because they think it's going to have a greater chance of success. What are some of the tools or whatever you use to try and validate that in the assessment process rather than at the acquittal stage?
It's a good question. I think the key thing for people when they do write grants is back it up with evidence. So it really falls back a little bit in some ways to how evidence-based the application is. It's not as though we're going to go out and try and engage accountants to do it, although in the Commonwealth we will look at financial viability as a potential thing before we're selecting applicants. It's really the evidence. Like if your organisation has only grown by a few people and then you're saying we're going to suddenly ramp up to 100 people, is that believable? It's around, if that's the case, then what's your evidence for that?
With our applications for budget, all our items requesting funding need a quote or some sort of substantiation of those costs. And sort of following on a bit from Brett, our peer assessors are specialists in that field, and there's a number of them, depending on the size of the grant. So we rely on their specialist knowledge to say, hey, that's a bit of a large claim, or no, that seems reasonable. And the peers have a broad range of experience to be able to understand if that's a reasonable claim or not. And also, the acquittal process you touched on. The acquittal process is if you really haven't met your aims and objectives, then questions will be asked. And if, as I said before, if you've bought a car when you said you do training, then that's obviously a red flag to us, which you'd need to substantiate. But I can't emphasise enough, and I'm going a little bit off your question, while you're in contract, if something goes wrong or needs to change, contact the program manager and see what you can do. But we rely on our peer assessors and their specialist knowledge of community areas to sort of validate that claim.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we've only got a few minutes left. If it's all right with the panel, I'm just going to do a quick rapid fire question, quick Q&A. So are we ready? Sure. I feel like I should have a timer behind me. All right. So what we've discussed then is reading the guidelines. You know how to shape your answer. How much detail is not enough or too much? Belinda.
We have word limits.
Right.
So that keeps you contained.
Excellent. All right. Dale, sometimes we need to have grant applications need letters of support. What are some of the things that applicants should think about in approaching those third parties for letters of support?
Are you collaborating with another group, or are you just getting a letter of support to attach to your application for the sake of attaching one? Try to draw a line between who's providing that support and what it means for them, because often a grant application is going to benefit your organisation, but how's it also going to help that other organisation? That shows that it has broader reaching benefits, which usually goes down well with the grant panel.
Yeah, great. And that was a rapid answer. Thank you. Once funding decisions are made and it's announced, Brett, in your jurisdiction, is there an appeals process? Why did my grant not get up even after the feedback loop has been concluded?
No, there's not. So, we need to be mindful of that. It's not really an appealable process. It's you were either successful for the grant or you weren't successful for the grant, and try and get some feedback around that grant. So, I'm not sure how it works in the other jurisdictions.
Not a formal appeal process specifically for grants, but DHS does have a complaints and review channel. Sure. So if you felt there was an injustice, it could be raised more generally through that avenue.
Mm-hmm. And same in...
No appeals.
No.
Council makes the decision, that's it, but try again next time.
Yep. And the feedback loop, as you've all described, is going to be incredibly important in that continuous learning piece. Yep. Yeah, right. And then I guess in terms of feedback, from your experience, Dale, what have you seen is the most valuable, the one thing you want everyone to walk away with today in terms of some feedback for people to be successful or more competitive? Yeah,
don't give up. Ask for feedback. And ring the grants officer. I think we've covered all those things already, but I just want to emphasise those again.
No, definitely. In state government then, Belinda, is there a central repository of where people can find a list of all grants?
So I want to let you know that there's Grant Assist for South Australian Government grants and assistance, and Grant Guru for grants across Australia. But I also wanted to remind you, within the State Government Departments, so Office for Sport and Recreation, Multicultural Affairs, Arts and Culture, Tourism and Environment, all have funding programs on a state level. So depending which way you want to go, there's some other avenues to potentially find support aside from Grants SA.
And we would go to each of their respective websites to find that information.
Yeah, but just consider them more generally. Yep. Yeah, and there's youth arts grants at Carclew too.
Right, okay, Carclew, right, okay.
Sorry. But Grant Guru and Grant Assist would be, channels to find grants that might be suitable.
Wonderful, and we'll make sure that that's included in the show notes as well for online. I guess then the last question I have for each of you before a final reflection is, we said at the top of the conversation around the importance of being fair and equitable throughout the whole process, and we can see how that links in, because then you're comparing apples with apples, then there's a basis of feedback that's valuable and consistent as well. Managing conflicts of interest. So Belinda, you'd mentioned around, in answer to the question from the floor, that there's people with lived experience or knowledge of the sector to be able to go, that's right or that's not. But with that can often introduce a potential conflict of interest. How's that managed?
Okay, so with our process, the peers have an online process, and then there's a meeting. We have, welcome to the peers. They're provided a list of applicants, so organisations, before they can see any application. If they believe they might have a conflict of interest knowing something about an organisation or being associated with an organisation, they can't go any further until they've declared if they perceive a conflict of interest with an application. If they do, we're notified, we talk that through, and then if we perceive that to be a conflict of interest, that grant is removed from their assessment and assigned to someone else. Yeah. We're really hot on that one.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, that's the foundation of confidence then.
Yeah.
I imagine it's the same, Brett and Dale, in your jurisdictions?
Very similar process for local government. Yep, very similar.
Yeah, and I think in the Commonwealth, we've got the dedicated assessment centre quite removed. In a lot of ways, staff do sign conflict of interest declarations when they need to, and we've got access to a probity advisor. So yeah, we try and cover it that way.
Great. Final reflections. We don't have any more questions from online. Do we have any more questions from the floor? Final reflections, Dale.
I think the grants officers are there to help. So not just don't be scared to pick up the phone, but talk through the application, everything with that grants officer. At a local government level, they're people who are involved in the local community, want to help the local community, want to support your projects, and also achieve the outcomes that council's trying to achieve. So they're trying to make it win for you and win for the organisation. So they're your best friend when it comes to the grant.
Great, thank you. Belinda, I feel like this is the end of Insiders. Final reflections.
I feel that we've covered most things. I suppose one thing I just wanted to observe with feedback, and again, encourage you, even if you're successful, because it's very rare that a grant scores 100%, so there's always something that you can carry forward. And with our grants, we try and provide an overarching comment about the round. So, you know, we might, and I'm just picking something out of the air, we might have had 350 applications for a budget of, so this percentage were funded. And then we try and draw a comment as a final comment from the peers. So we know that general comment sometimes is hard, but we're trying to put your work in the context of a whole community or number of grants. So that's why we try and the feedback might be quite short, but we do try and consider that. So yeah, usually there's a general comment about the round and then a specific comment from your grant. There might be something that you didn't follow through or was unclear. So yeah, but we do try and give that overarching context.
Great, thank you. And Brett?
And for me, I'd kick myself if I didn't say go to Grant Connect, which is the Australian Government grants. So it's grants.gov.au. And there's also the Community Grants Hub has a hotline, which is 1800 020283. So that's where you go for Commonwealth grants. And Grant Connect, you do have to sign in. You can then get access to the documents, the grant opportunity guidelines and questions and answers and information on the grants. So that's the way to do it for Commonwealth.
Wonderful, great. And we'll make sure again that those Commonwealth resources are also available in the show notes as well. Well, without further ado, I would like to thank our panellists, Brett, Belinda and Dale, for coming and talking about, whilst we didn't talk about specific programs, and that was deliberate because we want to, I guess this is a capacity building opportunity to help people think about grants applications before you get to that stage, and also to make you aware of some other opportunities that are out there. As members of the veteran community, you don't need to limit yourselves to applications for dedicated veteran funding. As we've heard today, there is great diversity, and if you can see what the outcomes of a grant program is, if it's in local, state or federal government, and you understand what those objectives are and can align that, then it sounds like that's a pretty powerful and competitive combination. So just in closing then, I'm going to do a gratuitous plug for the fact that Veterans SA does have its own grants program, the Anzac Day Commemorative Fund, which is our annual grants funding of up to $100,000 that is available. Those guidelines and the round will open at the end of September, so we will publish that widely, but not exclusively, because we also want to make sure that from our three panellists today, that as your grant information becomes available, we would like to share that more widely as well, to ensure that our veterans community can be more competitive. So again, on your behalf, thank you Dale, Belinda and Brett, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. We will see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of folks what's hungry and cold done stop believing what they've been told by Roosevelt, 'cause the pot's still empty and the cupboard's still bare, and you can't build a bungalow